As I laid awake in bed last night, I tossed and turned for hours trying to focus on falling asleep, my eyes closed and breathing slowly and deeply. Still, sleep never came. As I laid there, wrestling with the wake demon, searching endlessly for the Sandman, I was frustrated with my inability to pass into dreamland. After 4 long hours, I sat up in my bed, thinking about my son, sad for what I had done, for what I had to do, for all that happened. It was just a blur now, but still it resonated sharply enough to have an effect on me. The memories were still fresh enough to haunt me. It was 1976, and I was 21 years old, fresh out of college, and I had returned home to the family farm, bright-eyed and ready to take on the world. I knew I was going to take this run-down farm of ours and turn things around, make a big success of things. I wanted to grow this farm into one of those mega farms with all the fancy equipment. I'd get big new tractors and new silos and new everything, brand new, bigger, better, modern and fancy. Just imagine me, Lewis Johnson, with a giant high-tech farm in this little town. It was a shame my father wasn't around to celebrate my graduation. He died about a year before. I knew he would have been so proud of me. Mama made sure I knew and understood that. She made up a lot for his absence when I came home. She met me with the biggest party I'd ever had. All the neighbors were there. I could have sworn she had invited the whole town. When I asked her about it, she just grinned and looked away and said, "No, son, I can't afford to feed the whole town." And then she laughed a big laugh. Still, I was so happy. It was the greatest party I'd ever had, but that level of happiness don't last long. Don't get me wrong. I was happy to be home, back in the town where I grew up, happy to see my mama again. But the state of the farm, since Dad passed away, it's gotten so bad. Mama tries to take care of things and she does the best she can, but there are just some things she can't do. So I have to help out, and I'm glad to do it. I've mostly been working the fields and doing what I could. She often had to hire temporary farm hands to help with the major work, which became more and more often as she was getting older. So Jorge and Rodrigo would come about twice a week, take care of some things, do some heavy lifting and moving things around. They really like harvest time because they got more steady work from Mama, and the pay was a little better too after she finishes the market sales. Although it still wasn't quite enough. The money she'd saved was running out, and I knew I had to do something. So I got a job. Wasn't the best job in the world in a town like this. You don't have too many options. The job I found was very simple. Took a position down at the feed store. It consisted of tossing hay and packing sacks of feed and whatever other grunt work the old man Wilson was getting too old to do. It was okay. I was able to help out with expenses on the farm, and sometimes I had a little money left over for myself. I was even able to earn just enough to keep Jorge and Rodrigo coming around to help. The perk of the job was that Mr. Wilson gave me a good discount on feed and seed whenever I needed to buy some. Well, that was my homecoming, and everything was fine until the night we found him. Mama and I had just finished up dinner. She was cleaning the kitchen, and I was sitting in my daddy's old chair watching a little TV before bed. Then I heard a noise out on the front porch. Mama heard it too. We both went to take a look, and I urged Mama to stay behind and I would check it out. She insisted on coming along since it was still her house. She said, "I can check my own door, thank you very much." So to check the door, the both of us went. I looked through the peephole while Mama peered out the window next to the door. Neither of us saw anything. Must have been a coon or something, or other animal or whatever. But it's gone now, I surmised. Ready to call it a fluke, we looked at each other and started back to what we were doing. Then we heard a sound like a baby crying. Quickly I opened the door to find a baby in a basket. I was completely shocked to see such a thing. It was a little baby boy. I thought this kind of thing only happened in stories. I scooped up the little bundle, basket and all, brought him in the house, and set him on the kitchen table. Mama and I stared at him for what had to be an hour. "What the hell are we going to do with him?" Mama asked. "Well, I suppose the first thing is to figure out how to feed him," I answered. "Well, then what?" Mama asked. "Well, we have to do something, Mama," I answered. "We have to call the authorities," said Mama. "That's what we have to do." "Okay, Mama, you're right. We'll make sure to get him fed, and then we'll make that call in the morning," I replied. We fed him and then got him cleaned up and put in a safe place to sleep. We both went to bed that night, both dumbfounded and excited. A new little life in the house. And of course, you may have guessed, it was not quiet. The next morning, I woke up to find the baby was gone. I was alarmed at first, but then I heard Mama talking to him in that silly baby talk voice mothers always use. I went downstairs to find Mama playing with the baby. "Hey, Mama," I interrupted. "You're up, honey?" she asked, flashing a big bright grin. "Did you call them?" I asked. Mama looked at me with sad but informing eyes. "Yeah, I did." I can see that she was sad about seeing the little tyke go, but she was right. It's the right thing to do. She fell silent for a moment. She seemed to regret having made that call, but after a minute or two, she snapped out of it. Then she put the baby down and said, "They should be here soon. We'd better get ready." "Okay, Mama," I answered. "You okay, Mama?" I asked. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just that it's been a while. A few years since there was a baby in the house. And well, it's got me missing your dad," she explained. We both stood there for a moment, looking at him, and he laid there completely oblivious to what was going on. A lady from the Child Protective Services came to interview us. We met her at the door. As she was walking up the steps to the porch, she immediately introduced herself. Miss Rowena Green was her name. "Glad to meet you, Miss Green. Won't you come in?" Mama greeted her. I offered Miss Green some coffee and a place to sit, and she passed on the coffee. "So, I understand by the information given to me, you reported that the child was left on your doorstep. Is that correct?" "Yes," I answered. We explained what happened and how the baby just showed up on our doorstep. And she was skeptical at first, thinking we might have kidnapped the baby. "So I'm not sure I understand what you're telling me," she said. "What's not to understand?" I asked. "You're telling me that someone just put their baby on your doorstep and disappeared without saying a word?" From the start, she got on my nerves, sitting there all prim and proper, looking down her nose at me because her glasses hung that low, probably on purpose, because she'd get to look at people that way. I was taken aback by her making accusations about me and Mama, about this child and where it came from. She had some nerve. Anyway, we quickly dispelled that thought. I mean, who would kidnap a baby just to turn it over to CPS? Okay. Do we look like kidnappers to you? Have there been any reports of a missing baby? I asked. Okay, I believe you, she relented. Okay, we need to do some paperwork and then get a list of potential fosters to receive the baby. I was absolutely floored by her suggestion. I thought she'd make a file and then leave the baby with us. Wishful thinking, I guess. Honestly, I didn't know the first thing about raising children, but I had Mama, and we could work as a team while I learned. I have to admit, I had immediately grown attached to that little bugger in that short a time. I hounded the lady about the kid. I was curious as to whether they found the mother or any of his family. And she told me that they hadn't found anyone yet. The trail was so cold that the mother couldn't be found, I guess. There had been no new births reported by the hospital around the time the kid was presumed to have been born. She also told me that if Mama and I wanted to take him on as fosters, we could. I was so excited to hear that, I immediately agreed. I had forgotten to ask Mama about it, but judging from the look on her face the other morning when he was here, I was sure everything would be fine. Okay, shall we get the paperwork started? Asked the caseworker. So when they brought that little monkey back home, Mama was kind of upset that I hadn't talked to her about it, but when she finally looked that little wiggler in the face, she melted right there on the spot. I knew she had grown to like him too, just as fast as I did. We named him Joshua. About 4 months had passed and things were great. Joshua had grown so much, and we had so much joy in taking care of him, playing with him, watching him grow. Based on what they told us about his examination, they estimated he was about 3 months old when we found him. So by now he would have been about 7 months old. And I proclaimed myself in the position of fatherhood over the boy. As much as I enjoyed him as an infant, I couldn't wait until he was old enough so I can take him fishing, exploring, and hunting, teach him how to farm and all that. You know, father-son stuff. We had a blast taking care of him and playing with him and loving him. Only there was one thing that concerned us. One night, he was not himself. He became feverish, constantly crying, and throwing god-awful fits. It just wasn't like him. At first, Mama thought it was colic. He didn't eat most of the day, and then all of a sudden, about 4 hours into his fit, he finally ate something. I would say at this point things were normal, but I will have you know that I was completely wrong about that. Now, his hunger was insatiable. I just couldn't understand it for the life of me. This little fart ate and ate and ate. We became so concerned about feeding him too much, so we stopped. And his fits and crying became unbearable, so we gave him a little bit more. Not too much, but just a couple of spoonfuls more. He was quiet while his mouth was busy. He doesn't need any more to eat, Bubba. Mama scolded me for feeding him so much. Well, heck, Mama, it's the only thing keeping him quiet, I replied. He doesn't know any better. He just needs his stomach to settle, said Mama. Then when he was done with that bit, up started the squalling, and oh my God, the screaming was horrific. It was so loud, my ears began to ring like some alarm was going off in a tiny room. So I gave him just a little bit more, a couple more spoonfuls, half loaded this time. I was sure this couldn't be good for him. Still, like a champ, he powered down everything I shoved into his face. Man, look at you go, little man, I exclaimed, forgetting about the sheer volume of it all. I sort of found myself cheering him on. Then he puked. Projectile style, as luck would have it. It got everywhere. Shot across the room like a spew cannon. You get that cleaned up, Mama laughed. I guess I knew I shouldn't have given him any more, but the crying wouldn't stop and my head couldn't take it anymore. At least now he was quiet. I stood there looking at that mess I had to clean up, but I didn't care. That little monster was quiet and I was happy about that. He looked happy too. Hell, he was so happy he went right to sleep. There was sweet silence then, and I was so appreciative. I didn't even mind having to clean up the mess. I whistled my way through it. A year had gone by and things were just dandy with Joshua. He was growing and learning. Every once in a while he'd have another one of those fits of his, but in total he had about 3 of those fits in the last year. However, it had gotten to where it doesn't really bother me much anymore. I'd come to understand what to expect. It just scared me a little bit about those bouts of hunger he gets. Still, most days are absolutely blissful. He was so smart, so energetic, a very good little boy. Mama passed a few weeks after Joshua turned 5 years old. Josh and I were devastated, but we pressed on. It was just him and me now. I was about 27 years old, and I had adopted Joshua by then, and I was starting to long for companionship. So every week or so, I would put little Josh in the care of a trusted neighbor and head to the local bar in hopes of meeting somebody. I didn't have a whole lot of luck in that area. Women in these parts are far and few between, so to speak. Some were not attractive. Some weren't as sophisticated as I would prefer. And most were just not interested in me. But by the time Josh was 10, I'd found someone. Her name was Karina Kimball. We became very close rather quickly. It just clicked, I guess. Joshua liked her too. He couldn't stay out of her sight very long. Things got kind of serious between me and Karina rather quickly. I moved her in after about 6 months of dating. We immediately became a happy family. However, it took some getting used to when Karina first encountered one of Joshua's fits. At first, she was a bit concerned, but after a couple of them, she was an old pro getting through it. That was a huge relief for me, since Joshua's fits became more frequent. Not by much, but a little more frequent. Instead of 2 or 3 in a year, it was more like 5 or 6. One night, though, things got a little hairy. Joshua started having one of his fits, but this one was different. On this night, I noticed the moon was full. I'm not sure if it was a full moon every time, but I know that on this night the moon was full. It was eerie and disorientating. Joshua was worse than ever. Not only did he have that fever, was irritable, and there was the return of that insatiable hunger. He was really hard to handle. On 2 occasions, he bit both me and Karina whenever we tried to calm him. We had trouble keeping him in bed, and he had developed a really filthy mouth. I didn't pay too much attention to that. It wasn't something he did any other time. I was sure it was just a fit, but oddly enough, it lasted longer than usual. They lasted a few hours before. This one lasted nearly until dawn. Karina wanted me to take him to see a doctor. I explained to her that he had seen several doctors. None of them could explain why these fits were happening. They say he was physically fine. She countered by suggesting a psychiatrist. I was livid that she could even suggest such a thing. I'm not taking my son to see a shrink like some little pansy kid that finds it hard to cope with life, I shouted. To ignore something like that is just the same as child abuse, Karina responded. Now, I love my son Joshua, and I love Karina. And it was that love that I had for both of them that I allowed myself to at least consider taking my son to see a shrink. So that's what I did. I found a very reputable psychologist in the next town. It was about an hour's drive away. After a few sessions, I was able to meet with the doctor, and she gave me a pretty good understanding of what Joshua was going through. After about 10 minutes of psychobabble and that I didn't understand, and the overall prognosis was that nothing was really wrong with him. A little bit of acting out, she said. Other than that, no real serious disorders or anything. She basically told me that I had to be that strict parent whenever those fits arose. You could imagine the relief I felt when she told me that, but I was still a little on the fence about strict parenting. It wasn't really my style, since it wasn't the way my father raised me. Still, I felt more like I was in control. I guess it was more her straightening me out instead of straightening him out. I kept taking him to see her. I would have to admit that it was really good for him. His fits were now far and few between. When he did have them, they were milder and more manageable. Doc's sessions apparently consisted of behavioral modification exercises and stuff. Whatever she was doing, I was surely grateful. I married Karina about a year later. Now she's my son's true mom. At that point, we were a true family. Joshua was ecstatic about it, even though he was already calling her mom, and she often introduced him as her son. They apparently had worked a deal between them to do such a thing. I guess they wanted to make me happy about a thing like that, and I was. Truth be told, I was just happy that they got along and clicked. Unlike other step-parents and stepchildren, now, however, it was all official. Things were going great from that point. Life was good. 3 days leading up to Joshua's 13th birthday, we had to take him to the emergency room. You see, he had another fit. I know I said his fits had become far and few between, but he still had them from time to time. For this fit, there was no exercise to help him. It was really bad. So much so, he had bitten a hole clean through his bottom lip. There was blood everywhere. At the emergency room, Karina and I had to answer a lot of questions as to how he got this hole in his lip. Oftentimes, when a child comes in with this type of injury, that child had been struck by something, the nurse explained. I was furious that they could have backhandedly accused me or my wife of striking our precious little child. Lady, you and your doctors need to take care of my baby boy and stop all these accusations you're making. That was what I was thinking. Instead, I kept my cool and answered all of their questions because I knew the truth, and the truth can't be faulted. They still wanted to keep him for observations because of the fever he was spiking. It was quite high. Reluctantly, Karina and I agreed. We also provided them with the contact information to the psychologist that Joshua was seeing, just so that they could understand that this was rather routine with us. Mr. Johnson, we understand that this could be routine for you, but we also want to make sure that his fevers are not due to some kind of infection. It's great that you're getting him help emotionally, but please let us give him the physical and medical help that may be needed, explained the doctor. Okay, I said begrudgingly. I reckon that was all I could do. I'm sure that they would have had my son taken away if I had refused, so there you go. The next morning, we got Joshy home. He had a lip full of stitches, but other than that, the doctors had given him a clean bill of health. They couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. Even a CAT scan didn't show anything wrong with him. From there, we went on with life as usual. Joshy's birthday came and went, and we were happy as clams. On his 17th birthday, Karina and I got him a car. 64 Chevelle. It wasn't much, but it was a good way for him to get around, meet and do things with friends, and even though he didn't have many, I was proud that he was so happy. It was nothing I wouldn't do for my boy. For a few weeks, things were fine. Joshua always let us know where he was going when he was going out. So respectful. Just another reason to be proud of my son. Then, things began to change a bit. He did meet some new friends. They weren't what I would call good people. They weren't necessarily bad, I don't think I could say. Hell, I never seen them do anything wrong, but you know when you don't trust somebody, you don't trust them. Karina said I should give him some slack or whatever, something about different generations and whatnot. I don't know. This is something kind of new to me. One night Joshua came home late. I had to admit, I was quite upset. I met him at the door. He was drunk, stumbling all over the place, slamming into everything in the room. To tell you I was unhappy would be an understatement. I was more disappointed than anything, though. I couldn't really get mad at him. I remember when I was his age. I got him straightened up a bit, put him to bed. We'll talk in the morning, I said. The next morning I heard him stumbling down the stairs. He was hungover, and I'm sure his head was pounding something serious. I had a bit of a mind to rap on the table and rattle his brain a little bit, but I thought that would be cruel. So I invited him to sit down, have some breakfast, which his mother made for him. You need to feed that pain, but first drink some water. You'll feel better once you get hydrated, I told him. I let him have a few bites of that wonderful breakfast his mom laid out for him before I began the conversation. Okay, let's talk about last night, son. It's no big deal, he said like it was no big deal. You don't understand, son. I want to talk about your recent behavior, not just last night, I said to him. I don't want to talk about it because you always get bent out of shape whenever we have these conversations about me and my friends, he scoffed. I wasn't appreciative of his attitude. This was not like him at all. We argued a bit. And then he got up from the table and stormed outside. He jumped into his car and sped off, and by then I was furious. I started after him, but Karina stopped me. Maybe he's having another fit, just differently, she suggested. Nah, he's just being a little shit, or a teenager, I answered. Either way, maybe try a little understanding, Karina said. I took her advice and let it go for a moment. When Joshua got back home, he was calmer, and he actually got home on time and sober. When he came into the house, I looked at him, and he looked at me. I just nodded him on to go to his room without question or fights. Maybe something I said actually sunk in when he had time to think about it. So there were a few more days or nights like that, however. It wasn't that he was cured of being a rebellious teen. Karina and I had to deal with it as it came. We got through it just like we did when he was little, and we just had to make sure he was safe. One night he came home, and there was blood on his clothes, little spots here and there. I asked him about it, but he wouldn't budge on where it came from. He became so secretive in those days. On his 18th birthday, he went out again with his friends, despite the fact that his mom and I had a great little birthday celebration planned for him. Karina made him a big, beautiful cake, and I had a nice big gift for him. Before we could start the festivities, he was out the door, gone to celebrate with his friends. We were quite heartbroken that day. Just as I suspected, he came home drunk, but something was different. He was different. He reeked of alcohol, but didn't stagger or stumble. Instead, he came into the house, walked past his mom and me like we were nothing. "Okay, that's it," I shouted. He turned and looked at me, inviting me to do something, but at the same time warning me to stay away. His breath was elevated, and I could tell his fever had spiked. I could feel the heat radiating off him from where I was standing. "Son, you okay?" I asked as my anger quickly turned to concern. "I'm fine, just tired," he answered. "Tired from what? Slipping out on your mother and me when we had a nice birthday planned for you?" I reminded him. "So it's the guilt trip now, huh, Dad?" "No guilt trip. No, son. Just an expectation that you might realize how you hurt your mother and me tonight." "Sounds like a guilt trip to me," he responded. That night we fought and argued back and forth. It went on until the sun came up. Everything that I was feeling about his behavior in recent days came out. Karina tried to calm us both down, but we didn't relent. We continued until the shoving started. That's when Karina jumped in between us. Neither of us wanted to hurt her. We really didn't want to hurt each other. We let our emotions get the better of us. After a few minutes of angry, heavy breathing, Joshua went to bed, and I wasn't too far behind him. It wasn't like us to be at each other's throats, but I didn't understand what happened to my son. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It was like living with a stranger. The next few weeks were about the same. No worse, no better. We had our spats, and this and that, mostly about his friends and his late nights. He didn't always come home drunk, but sometimes he just came home angry or agitated. He never wanted to talk about it. One evening, I had just finished my work in the fields. It had been a long day. A few pieces of equipment were in need of repair, and some parts were needed, but wouldn't be available for about a week. I was sitting out on the front porch just catching my breath. Then I heard the police sirens whirring from the road. It was a gang of them, one after another. They were in a big hurry somewhere. Wasn't sure. The first thing that popped in my head was Joshua. I became very worried. I hadn't seen him all day, and I didn't know where he'd gone. Karina stepped out when she heard the noise. "Was that the police?" she asked worriedly. "It was," I answered. "Joshua?" "Don't know. Hope not." I leaned forward in my chair, wrenching my hands. Karina came and sat down beside me, took her hand and held it tight. "I'm sure he's okay, But about an hour went by and we heard nothing. We hadn't heard from our boy yet, but we tried to stay calm. Then headlights appeared in the driveway. It was Joe Ferguson from the next farm over, coming over in his old pickup. He pulled up to the house and jumped out of his truck. "Hey, neighbor." "Joe, just stopped by to chit-chat a bit. Did you hear what happened?" "Hear what?" Karina asked. "They found a body over at Shirts Lake," he replied. "Who?" "Can't say," he responded. "Unrecognizable, they say. Body was torn to shreds like an animal attack." I wasn't ready to buy into it. There's nothing around that could do anything like that to a person. "You sure you heard right, Joe? Nothing like that around here. There used to be wildcats around here years and years ago, until they all got hunted out," said Joe. "Yeah, maybe they weren't all gone," I thought out loud. Joe came back with, "Yeah, maybe." We talked more for a couple of hours, and the sun had gone down, and it was dark as pitch. The only light there was coming from the lamp I had sitting on the table beside me. And then Joshua arrived, agitated as usual. The conversation instantly fell quiet as we watched him get out of his car. "What's everybody looking at?" Joshua asked. "Hey, Joshua, how you doing?" "Fine," Josh answered, annoyed. Then he just walked by everybody and went inside the house. I was going to say something about his rudeness to Joe, but Karina stopped me. "Let him go. Just be glad he's home and he's okay." Joe was kind of confused about the comment, so we explained to him what had been going on with Josh the past few days. And then about how we feared the worst when we heard those sirens. Joe was pretty understanding about it. "I'm not offended. Hell, he's just a kid," said Joe. Joe hung around another hour or so before he took off. Karina and I stayed out there a few minutes more and then decided to go to bed. As we laid in bed, we could hear through the walls the conversation Joshua was having with his friends on the phone. I couldn't really make out exactly what he was saying. I could only catch a few things, and they didn't sound right to me. "What if they find out?" His voice murmured and reverberated through the wall. The next morning I tried to talk to him again about it. He was closed up as usual, only this time without all the animosity. He was calm and actually quite polite. Still, so full of secrecy. I backed off, saying, "Okay, buddy, I get it. You're 18 now." He looked up at me almost as if he knew what I was going to say next. I continued, "You've got your own life now. That means you're a man now. So it's time to be a man. Get a job and get your own place." It's funny how when you challenge your semi-grown jobless kids with independence, they instantly turn into the most polite, apologetic, self-repentant little angels. Of course, like the spineless jellyfish of a dad I was, I relented and allowed him to stay. Back up to his room he went. In a way, I was kind of relieved. Karina looked at me with big Cheshire cat type eyes. "You weren't going to kick him out anyway," she scoffed. "I guess not. I don't know. I'm just glad it didn't have to come to that," I answered as she stroked my face. Hopefully that little standoff might straighten him out. Things were fine the next few months. He still went out with his friends, but not as often, and not really any late nights. He seemed to fall back in line and respect my house rules. I was okay with that. Joshua's 19th birthday was coming up, and Karina and I were planning something again for Joshua, but this time we made sure to tell him that we had plans. Didn't want to have any repeats of the last birthday. Then 3 days before the day, we found a note he'd left for us. "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry to do this to you, but Jake and Daryl invited me to go on a road trip for my birthday. I know you had special plans for me, and I hate to miss it, but they promised to take me to see some sights in the city. I want to celebrate my birthday with you too, but I didn't want to miss out on seeing the city. I should be back the day after. Maybe we can celebrate then. I know it's not the same, but I figure a late celebration is better than none at all, don't you? I love you, Joshua. Again, I was disappointed, and Karina was devastated. Again. He was turning 19. Nothing really I could do. I consoled my wife that night, and we made the best of it. The big day came and went, and we heard nothing from our boy the whole time. The next day, he made it home like he promised, and we celebrated his birthday a day late, though sadly, Karina's heart just wasn't in it that day. She just sort of went through the motions. She tried to smile, but as she explained to me later on, it was hard to do because it just wasn't the same if it wasn't on the day. I couldn't say I blamed her, but I think she did a pretty good job getting through it all. A few days later, Karina was picking up the dirty clothes in Joshua's room for the laundry, and she noticed a few pieces had blood on them. And she told me about it, and she wanted me to talk to him. She was worried. There had been a couple of more strange murders in the area since that last time. A few people had gone missing. I can't lie and say that I wasn't nervous about the conversation I needed to have. The last time, it didn't go so well. It finally gotten peace in our house. Most of all, I hated to think that there was any possibility that my son could have anything to do with this strange occurrences. He was working now, so I waited for him to get home from work. I needed to know everything was fine. When he came home, he was agitated and wired. His breathing was heavy, and he was feverish again. I thought, oh, you're having one of your fits. Okay. It's not a fit, old man, he shouted back at me. Yep, I replied. Go on, get up to your room and try to stay calm. As he traipsed up the stairs, I called out, You hungry? Fuck you, he snapped. And then I heard his door slam. Yep, it's a fit. I thought to myself as I took a breath, trying to let that filthy response wash over me. It was just him reacting to his fit. I knew that this was not the time to try to have a conversation with him. Karina appeared at the top of the stairs looking at me for confirmation that I had had that talk with him, but I had to explain that it was no use trying to have this talk, not when he's having a fit. I promised I would talk to him in the morning. We both went to bed. During the night, we heard Josh writhing in his room, and sometimes we heard him pounding on his mattress. He grunted and groaned. I got up to check on him. When I knocked on the door, Joshy, you okay? Go away, I'm fine. I let him work through it as I have in the last few years. He seemed to get through it fine. Tomorrow he'll be right as rain. I went back to bed. Just before I did, I said a little prayer for him. It was about 4:36 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was woken up by police pounding on my door. They were looking for Joshua. I sent Karina to go get him, but she came back down saying he wasn't in his bed. I told this to the cop, but the cop was more aggravated about that. He said it was imperative that they find him. I asked him what he had done, but they clammed up and said they just wanted to ask him some questions. I knew that was bullshit. I asked if the cop would spend that much time banging on someone's door the way he did, just to ask some questions. Who the hell did this Giacomo think he was fooling? Still, after all that, I was still worried that my boy was in trouble. God forbid my boy did something to arouse the law. Well, if you see him, please give us a call, sir, the cop said. Sure thing, officer, I replied unconvincingly. He left my porch and got back in his car, and I shut the door. I turned around to find Josh standing at the top of the stairs. I looked up at him. He could tell by the look on my face that I was suspicious. He quickly disappeared to his room. Fine, son, but in the morning, we're talking, I yelled up at him. And then the door slammed. I don't really understand where I went wrong. I had given him everything he could possibly ask for. Still, my son was seemingly unappreciative. I spent a few minutes pondering about it and then decided to turn in. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. The cop had returned looking for Joshua. Luckily, Joshua wasn't up yet, so it was easy to say that he hadn't come home yet. pencil neck asshole wanted to check the house, but I told him he needed to get a warrant to get in my house. I'm not some hippie fucker that hates cops. I love cops, and I respect them when they're not coming after me and mine for no reason. When the officer left, and I was sure he was long gone, I immediately went upstairs to wake Josh up. We needed to have that talk. When I got to his room, the door was left cracked open a bit, like he's left it open for me. I guess he was going to make it easy to talk to him. I was definitely relieved that I wasn't going to have to struggle to get anything out of him. In fact, I was optimistic in the fact that I was going to learn that he had done nothing. Still, I knocked on the door to announce to him that I was available to talk, but there was no answer. Given the fact that his door was open, I took it upon myself to walk right in, only to find that Joshua wasn't even in the room. "Joshy," I called out, hoping he would answer from a different part of the house. There was no answer. I called out again, but still nothing. I went downstairs thinking maybe he didn't hear me from the upper floor. So I went downstairs to the kitchen, hoping to find him sitting at the breakfast table, wolfing down a third bowl of cereal or something like that. I didn't find him there either. I called out again, and still no answer from my son. My wife answered, however. "He's gone already," she said. She told me that he had gotten up earlier in the morning and left the house. He seemed to be in a hurry. I couldn't help but think the worst by then. Reason being, if he hadn't done anything, he wouldn't be running. That's it, I belted. God knows I love my son, but he's got to go. Karina tried calming me down, but there was no calming me down. I was furious, but more so, I was tired of it all. We spent a third of our lives trying to raise our children to be the best individuals they can be. We sacrifice so much to make sure they become upstanding, functioning members of society, and then they turn against you and all that you try to teach them. Then they go out of their way to make you feel like you failed. It's a slap in the face. All this I conveyed to my wife. All she could do was nod and say, "Okay." A second later she added, "But promise me you won't shut him out and refuse to see him when he comes around." "Okay," I answered. 3 weeks went by. We hadn't heard from our boy. Not a phone call, not a visit, not even a note left on the front porch. We hadn't heard from him, and Karina was worried. I must admit, I was a little worried, but my contempt for his attitude towards life and social responsibility was still high and heavy. I wouldn't budge on my decision that he needed to be on his own, at least until he's learned some respect. I went out to the barn that night. I had the urge to do something, so I decided to go out and do some cleaning. Hadn't been cleaned in a while, so I could kill two birds with one stone. I could burn off some extra energy, and then the barn gets an overdue cleaning. I was sweeping the barn floor. As I made my way back towards the back area, I noticed the hay on the floor was getting strangely darker than it should have been, given the time that it was there. There was a smell, too. It wasn't the usual barn smell. It was the smell of rot and dead flesh. Normally, I would dismiss this as maybe some rat, maybe some other animal had died or something. That was my first thought. Still, I got curious and started looking around for the source of that smell. I looked around all over the floor, and I looked and searched and looked some more. I didn't find a single thing. Then, as I was about to give up and go back to my routine cleaning, I found it. I damn near tripped over it. I looked closely at it, but still wasn't able to fully make out what I was seeing. The light wasn't that great back there, and so I leaned forward, squinting and straining my eyes, trying to build a visual picture of what was down there on the ground. It looked like bones, human bones, from what I could tell. I charged towards the front of the barn to grab a shovel, and I walked back to the pile of bones and scooped them up and carried them into the light so I can get a good look at them. They were human bones, all right. A few ribs, a femur, and I think a couple of radials. They all appeared to have teeth marks on them. Strangely, no skull or teeth. I I tried to think back to a time when I could remember hearing any strange noises coming from the barn. Maybe something that I dismissed as maybe animal restlessness. Not a single memory came to mind. It was uncanny. I couldn't for the life of me figure out where this mess could have come from. Then it hit me, like a freight train in the middle of the night. Joshua. This is what he'd been hiding. All this time, he'd been hiding the fact that he'd killed someone. I couldn't bear it, knowing that my boy had done something like this. Drinking, okay. Maybe a little getting high from time to time. Okay. But this was beyond the line. I fell instantly to my knees, weeping and blubbering like some baby without a mother. My son was a murderer. I think about 15 minutes had gone by until I managed to dry my face, suck up the last of my sobs, and breathe steady breaths. I hoisted myself to my feet with a little help of the shovel, thinking something's got to be done. I found myself digging a hole in the field, a pile of bones beside me, until I got the hole deep enough to toss those bones into that hole and not to be detected. I truly despised what Joshua had done, but I couldn't just let his life end like this. I consoled myself with the thought that no one knows what happened to this poor soul. For all I know, he could have stumbled into the barn, high on smack or something, and died there quietly. Unlikely, but no one knows anything different. So, that's the story if he ever got discovered, which was highly unlikely. After I buried the remains of Mr. Whoever it was, I sat down on my front porch, drenched in sweat, tired and ready to pass out. I buried that shit deep, and Karina came out to see about me, and she brought me something nice and cold to drink. Thank you, baby, as I received the cool glass in my hand. You look tired, hon, she said. I'm okay, and this drink sure hit the spot, I answered. Then she sat down next to me and we stared at the sunset. In a strange way, I was at peace. I'm not sure if it was because of the fact that I once again protected my son. After that day, I went on about my days as if nothing had happened. I didn't tell Karina about what I'd found in the barn. It would have killed her. I didn't want her to hurt anymore. It was bad enough Joshua vanished without a trace, without a word, not even to let us know he was still alive. No, I just kept that little secret to myself. It was Joshy's and my little secret. That is, if Joshua had anything to do with it. 3 months had gone by since Joshy left. Not a word, not a single sign of him. Then, like a ghost, he showed up at our front doorstep. He was skinny and poor as can be. It looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks. Excitedly, I invited him in. With much trepidation, he crossed the threshold of my front door. I did everything I could to make him feel welcome and comfortable. He seemed to struggle with that kind of treatment, but managed it okay, I guess. I told him about the cops that were looking for him. I told him that they came around a couple of more times after he left. Those fuckers were really after you, I said. He indicated that was the reason he stayed away for so long. He told me he wasn't sure he was going to come back that night, but something drew him here. I just felt like this was the place to be right now, he explained. Plus you were hungry, and you have no money. That's what I wanted to say. But I kept that comment to myself, and instead replied, well, the only thing that matters is that you're here. He looked at me like he was wanting to say something important. That look in his eyes that made me think of that pile of bones I found in the barn. I so badly wanted to ask him about it, but I couldn't bring myself to mention it. Are you hungry? You have to be hungry. I can tell, said Karina as she entered the room with a tray carrying 2 plates piled with food. Joshy reached up at a plate like a child after a piece of candy. It was absolutely the most adorable thing I had seen in a very long time. So I suppose I'd let him eat and enjoy his dinner before any conversation like the barn bones needed to be had. After dinner was done, Karina was in the kitchen cleaning up, and she was well out of earshot, so I figured it was time to bring up that awful subject. "I found human bones in the barn," I blurted. He didn't flinch or in any other way change his demeanor. I stared at him, waiting for a reaction, but there was none. The only response I got from him was, "Really?" I proceeded to tell him the whole story about the bones and what I had done with them and every thought that I had in between. Still, he didn't flinch. "Some drunk or druggy, maybe," he responded. "Maybe," I answered. "Could have been that. But there were marks on the bones. Scavenging animals, I guess," he offered. "Likely so," I accepted. Every response he gave to my suggestion just made complete sense, and it was completely in line with my thoughts about the whole thing. I felt so much at ease with it all. I guess I was worried for no reason. He got very quiet after that. He just sat there staring at the floor. I watched him for a while, watching the carpet fade. "Something the matter, son?" I asked. He didn't respond. He was deep in thought about something. "Hey there, son. You okay?" He looked up at me, these eyes. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking at this point. My head had been on such a roller coaster ride, I didn't know which way was up. "Do you know what day it is?" he asked in a soft, whispery voice. "It's Monday, son," I answered. "No, Dad," he snapped. Let me try to rephrase. Wasn't sure where he was going, but he was sure to let me know. "Do you know what happens tonight?" he asked. "No, son. What?" I answered. I was a little confused by the question. I couldn't figure out what was happening that night that was of any significance. There were no sports events, no events in town. It wasn't a holiday. Nothing came to mind. "What's all this about, Joshy?" I pressed. "It's almost time. The sun's nearly down and it's almost time," he answered. Confused, I looked out the window at the crimson sky as the sun was setting. I noticed Joshy's breathing was getting heavier. He started to get agitated and bothered. And then I caught on. It finally hit me. He'd come home because he was about to have another fit. I guess by now he could feel it coming on. Well, I was ready for it. Hell, I'd been through it many, many times before. Joshua started twitching, and this was something new. But somehow I knew I could handle it. And then snorting started. Also something new. I sat there staring at him as he went through his convulsions, and his head writhing back and forth and rolling along his shoulders. Okay, this is going to be a big one, I thought. Josh leaned forward and put his face in his hands, his very hairy hands. This was not a fit. This was something else. His twitch became more violent as his breathing became even heavier. And I thought at this point it couldn't get any worse, but there came the sound of bones crunching and breaking. "Oh God, Joshua, what is happening to you?" I cried. Then through the window was a glare of headlights. Someone had just pulled up to the front of the house. This was definitely not the time to entertain visitors. "Joshy, we need to get you upstairs to your room," I said. It was like he didn't even hear me, nor could he hear the voices outside that called out to him. There was a bunch of hooting and hollering going on out there. I knew then it could only be those ne'er-do-well friends of his. "Josh!" they called out, again and again. I tried to urge Joshy to go upstairs, but he didn't respond to me. "Josh, let's go. Get upstairs, now." Nothing from Josh outside of him writhing and rolling on the ground. Every time I looked at him, my heart nearly exploded. I couldn't imagine the agony he was in. And there was also the terror, as with each glance, there was more hair in places where there wasn't supposed to be, and the air filled with a stench I've never smelled before. I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but more and more I watched my son go through whatever it was he was going through. And the more I watched my son and what he was going through, the more I was convinced that smell was coming from my son. I wasn't able to focus on that too long. There was still the matter of those people on my front lawn. "Josh," the voice called out. "Get the fuck out here." "Okay, kiddo. I know you're not in the best of shape, but we need to get you upstairs now," I muttered as I took him by the arm and tried to help him up the stairs. Then the door crashed open, and as I guessed, it was his friends breaking down my door. When I turned my attention from Josh and onto that front door, I was gripped by a very large, hairy hand at the front of my shirt. Joshua grabbed me and lifted me up off my feet and tossed me across the room like a piece of paper. "Oh, yeah," screamed Joshua's bum friend, Jake. He stood there breathing heavy and covered in hair, just like my Joshua. Also like Joshua, I could feel the heat radiating off of him. It was like two furnaces in my living room. "Why don't you finish it, Josh? It's what you're supposed to do. It's why you're here," Jake rambled. I jumped to my feet and stepped between the two of them. "You leave my boy alone, Jake," I ordered. And at that moment, Jake stepped toward me, and with one swipe, he knocked me back onto the couch. "Finish it, Joshua," Jake demanded. Then in stepped the others, Daryl and some other bastard I didn't know, and two of them lumbered into the house, hairy and as stinky as the high heavens. And when Jake moved to attack me, Josh was all over him. The two began to fight and tussle all over the house. There was only the noise of furniture crashing and Karina screaming and angry growls of the two boys locked in deadly battle. After a minute or so, it seemed Joshua was gaining the upper hand, and then the other two got in. My boy was truly outnumbered. Still, he continued to fight, biting and scratching, punching and grabbing, tossing and wrestling. I thought it would never end. All my beautiful furniture and other things of value completely destroyed, smashed to bits. Karina managed to avoid getting bumped into or somehow mixed up in the commotion, and she made it outside through the back door, and she waited for the outcome, whichever it may be. I, on the other hand, got pinned in the corner of the room, unable to get out. Every time I tried to get out of that corner, a dog pile found its way right in front of me. All I could do was just sit there and wait, with my eyes half closed and my face covered and protected by my hands. The whole thing was so terrifying, and then I heard a loud crack. Joshua managed to pick Jake up, lift him above his head, and then he brought him down onto the head of Daryl, and the action breaking Jake's back and Daryl's neck. And the two of them dropped onto the floor, lifeless and dead. The third hairy bastard immediately stopped his pursuit of the fight and ran out the door. Everything was quiet now. Nothing was left in the house to make noise other than to crunch under your foot. I got up from my useless hiding spot to check on the condition of my home. I was devastated over the breakage, but still I was relieved that it was all over and my son, whatever he was still alive. In that thought, I turned to my son to make sure he was really okay, and his rage was still on full and hot. He began stomping and scratching at the walls. I didn't recognize him now. He was so changed. His body and face full of hair, and the face changed its shape. For God's sake, my son had a snout like a dog, and his eyes were big and black. He had pointy ears, and body-wise, he stood about 7 feet, hunched over. I really didn't know what I was looking at, but it wasn't my son. My heart fell to the floor as I was in distraught because I knew at that point what I had to do. I reached into the gun closet where I just happened to be standing next to, and I grabbed my 12-gauge shotgun off the rack. I racked one round into the chamber and pointed the gun to my monster of a son. When he saw the barrel pointed directly at him and me standing behind it, his rage immediately calmed and then turned to fear and sorrow. He hunched all the way down, lowering his head submissively. I knew he wasn't going to fight me on this, and tears began to stream down my face unstoppably. I took a deep breath and sighed as he let out a weak whimper, the same sound you hear when a dog knows he's done something bad. and Karina came back in the house after hearing all the noise fall to silence. I guess she figured it was safe to come back in at that point. And when she entered the living room, she was met with the sight of me holding a shotgun on my only son. "No!" she cried, trying to stop me from doing what I knew I had to do. But when she got right up beside me, she was able to see what actually I was intending to kill. And she let out a horrible scream as she witnessed that beast that our baby boy had become. Her protest immediately turned to silent compliance as she backed away, with a face drenched in sorrow and tears. And when Joshua saw that she stepped back and faded into the kitchen, he then slowly and gently scooted closer to the barrel of my gun, still whimpering, but louder than before. It was as though he was giving me the green light to end his life. And I knew then that he didn't want to live like this. I knew that all the trouble and strife he gave me in recent years was his way of distancing himself from me and his mom, and that his coming home was for the purpose of this moment right here. So, woefully and trepidatiously, I took sure aim, planting the barrel of my shotgun on my baby boy's head, and in a loud, short bang, the world went dark. The last thing I remember was the sound of my son's body dropping to the floor and my wife crying uncontrollably.